Welcome everyone to the Earth Exchange Cafe in January of 2022. Happy New Year to everyone. This is the cafe where we introduce interesting people who are thinking about the human relationship with the earth in new and inspiring ways, and creating new ways for people to be in relationship with the earth. And so we invite you to be present with us for the next hour, to imagine that you're in a cafe, a really cozy cafe on a cold January day, perhaps, and you have a cup of your favorite tea or coffee or chocolate, and you're sitting among the people whom you really care about and with whom you share a lot of ideas, and yet they're never predictable. Their ideas always surprise you and lead into all kinds of interesting and fascinating pathways. And so today we're going to engage in one of those conversations in this cafe. So settle back and relax and enjoy it. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat and we will respond to those later. And so to introduce our guest today, Caroline Brazier, we're very excited to talk to her and explore her ideas and her work, is our co-guide, co-host on this cafe, Harriet Sams.
Thank you, Trebbe, and welcome, Caroline. So I'll just quickly introduce you and then invite you to introduce yourself. Caroline Brazier is a psychotherapist and was the founder and leader of the 10 Directions Ecotherapy training course that ran until recently in Leicestershire, but due to COVID went 100% online. And Caroline is now enjoying or trying to enjoy semi-retirement in the north of England, and has very kindly agreed to come and talk to us and delve into this beautiful, rich conversation about ecotherapy and working in difficult environments and the Buddhist approach, and all sorts of other interesting things. So very welcome to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Harriet. It's interesting hearing you say that and talking about kind of semi-retirement and so on, because I was just talking before we started about how actually stepping back from some of the stuff I've been doing online, I'm actually getting much more opportunity now to actually be outdoors and how important that feels. And, you know, I think that illustrates so much the sort of dilemmas of modern life, because I think being online is really important to me because it's a way of communicating with people and talking to people and raising issues that I think are really vitally important. And at the same time, that direct engagement with nature, with the outdoors, with the world, you know, I think that's really the central human experience, and it's what I hope to encourage for others. And so lovely to be doing it more myself now.
And I think we all benefit from that, and I'm glad that you're giving yourself the time to do that. And I'd love to sort of circle back to that at some point, because I think it might actually feed into the idea of sort of level 1 ecotherapy, level 2 ecotherapy, and sort of how do we take care of ourselves and take care of our relationship to the planet, to the earth. So anyway, before we get into that, let's sort of go right back in time, and I'd love you to explain a little bit about what made you decide or develop the 10 Directions Ecotherapy course in the beginning, and could you tell us a little bit about the Buddhist philosophy approach, the Buddhist psychology approach, and what the other-centered model is?
Oh goodness, there's a lot there. I kind of feel like you've just invited me to tell my life story, but anyway, I will start and we'll see where it goes. How did I start doing the 10 Directions course? Well, prior to that, I've been involved in Buddhism and in therapy for, well, since the 80s, since the 1980s. And I've particularly been involved in running a therapy training course run from a Buddhist model since the mid-90s. And that course was run under a number of different organizations, but came to be run under Tariki Trust in the end. So that's been a big part of my work in developing the Buddhist model. And, you know, I think that that's really emerged out of my own experience of Buddhism. I mean, I came to therapy originally in the 80s because I got involved in a bodywork group. We were doing yoga, we were doing other kinds of body things, and we were doing meditation. And the group was run by somebody who was Buddhist. And so I became very interested in the practicalities of it. And I think that kind of practical engagement with our bodies, for me, has always been the basis of any kind of therapeutic work. You know, we sit on the earth, we feel the earth beneath us. And as we feel it and we feel ourselves solidly present, then our minds can settle and we can start to understand some of the layers of conditioning that have built up within the mind. So for me, the therapeutic process starts with an embodied state. And that embodied state is something to do with our connection to the earth and our connection to our environment. I probably wouldn't always have framed it exactly in that language. You know, I think over the years I've moved more overtly into the ecotherapy world, but our engagement with what is beyond ourselves, I think, is the fundamental part of our mental health, whether it's our engagement with other people or our engagement with the physical nature of our surroundings. So exploring that connection and inviting that connectedness and stepping out of our kind of individual bubbles of neurosis and attachment and grasping and all of those things that Buddhism actually talks about a lot. Stepping out of that into a more direct relationship with others, whether they're human or other than human. I think this is the fundamental aspect of good health. So I've been working with Buddhist psychology for a long time. And I guess I've also been involved with working outdoors for a long time, though in rather disparate ways. I think from childhood, I always loved being outdoors. It was always my place of refuge, was to be out in the woods. And that never really stopped. But I suppose when as an adult, I came into, well, various aspects. I trained as a teacher. I did archaeology at one point, like yourself. I also worked in community work quite a bit. And I always enjoyed the outdoor aspects of these things. I enjoyed taking people outdoors and working with them in the outdoors and inviting them to experience it in a variety of different ways. So the ecotherapy aspect really developed around, I think 2010, I ran an ecotherapy week at our center that we had in France at the time. And that was really about exploring what it was like to work therapeutically outdoors. It was experimental. I did it with another member of staff, and we had a group, and we really just tried different ways of working. I mean, stuff I'd done elsewhere under different contexts, but we experimented with it in an overtly therapeutic way. And we found it was very fulfilling. So as a result of that, I started to write about my experiences of working therapeutically outdoors. And the first of my ecotherapy books came out of that, The Acorns Among the Grass, which is really just a collection of explorations of different modes of engagement with the outdoors. Some of it is a description of that week that we ran. Some of it is my own experiences. Some of it's based on aspects of Buddhist psychology, like working with the elements and so on. So that book was very much a patchwork, and really myself getting my thinking around different ways in which one can work out of doors. And it was really from that I started to think about how could we actually create a training out of this? How could we start to get people not just working as therapists, as we've been training them for a long time, but how could we get them training in working outdoors? And so out of that, the 10 Directions program emerged. And we started running that in 2011 in France. The first year I did it, I invited people to come and work with me, and I only had 3 students that first year. It was very interesting. It was something new I'd floated, and I thought, oh goodness, I'm not sure I can run a year's course with 3 students. But then I looked at who they were, and actually all of them were extremely experienced. And so I thought, well, this is interesting because this can be a collaborative experience. And I think in a way, this collaboration is something that I like about ecotherapy. It's something that I think is really important to the field because it is a kind of ecosystem in itself. You know, when you ask what's ecotherapy, ecotherapy is a very umbrella kind of term, and people come to it from a whole lot of different backgrounds. You know, some of them, like myself, are psychotherapists who've started to work outdoors and are experimenting with that. But there's also other people who've come from all manner of other disciplines, people who are used to working outdoors, maybe with groups, maybe with individuals, and who then start to work in a more therapeutic way, people who are coming from more spiritual traditions, more into running retreats, and then that develops a therapeutic element to it. So people are bringing a lot of these different fields together, and they're working in a lot of different ways. And it's a real kind of ecosystem of courses. You've got everything from people who are kind of doing horticultural therapy in a community center to people who are taking people up mountains, who are doing shamanic processes, all sorts of things. It's a very, very broad field. And so that first year, I really worked with these other 3 people, and we explored what it was. We had 3 weeks, different times of year through the year, out in France, exploring it. And from that, the course emerged in its well, pre-present form, largely in the form it is now, but it's been through a number of incarnations, as you know.
And yes, and I think that's it's really interesting what you're saying about how diverse it attracts so many diverse people. And you know, I have a hunch that what really brings people is not necessarily the sort of the therapeutic aspect, but behind that is a feeling of finding some sort of way of helping people connect to the wounded earth. So it's like, yes, it is obviously in itself, you know, helping a therapeutic model. And would you agree with that often when I found that didn't, because I met quite a lot of different people over the 3 or 4 years that I was there, and it felt like the conversation about, you know, ecological derangements and the current chaoses that we're experiencing was always ready and present to be talked about. And I felt that was very much a uniting and unifying sort of core reason. Did you find that as well?
I think it can be different things for different people, you know, and I think there is a wide range. I think for some people, it's a kind of retreat from reality. You know, certainly I've come across plenty of people who want to go out into nature because it's beautiful, it's soft, it's spiritually uplifting, and so on, and who in a way want to escape from life. But I think, and you know, I think there's some validity in that. You know, some people have just struggled with life so much that actually finding some peace and quiet in a beautiful view or a beautiful space can be really important and healing. So I don't want to kind of knock that. But at the same time, I think as you go into it, your eyes start to open and you start to open up to it. And I think as you start to open up to it, then of course, you start to see it in all its colors, and you see not just the beauty, but also the tragedy and the destruction and the woundedness, as you say. So I think both things are true. And I think it's really important that people can meet it where they're at and can meet it in terms of their needs. But I think there's a kind of process that goes on. And maybe it's something about a process of learning to trust the bigger picture. You know, I think there's an awful lot in this about trust. That, you know, we start off wrapped up in our own individual worlds. And in a way, I'm drawing on Buddhist psychology here, that we're in a state of retreat. And in those worlds, we're very frightened of the things that we don't understand, the things that threaten our existence, the things that threaten those things we love and those things we assume to be. And so in a way, we're looking for a kind of reinforcement of that. And so that kind of initial stage of just going out and enjoying the view, enjoying the sunshine, you know, this stage is really important in terms of just gently starting to learn to trust life again. But then, of course, as we do that, we become less self-invested. We start to realize that the world around us exists in its own right. It does its own thing. It's not only other than human, it's other than us. And that otherness starts to speak to us. And we realize that actually there's a relationship here, and that we can trust that relationship. And as we start to trust that relationship, then it is, I think, we start to see the woundedness. And then, you know, it can be overwhelming. There can be grief, deep grief, you know, because that thing which we loved, which we trusted, which we felt held by, suddenly we realize that actually, in its own right, it's suffering. In its own right, it's being destroyed. And then I think there's some sort of a crisis there. You know, we hit that kind of existential crisis where that thing which is so precious to us actually it's threatened. And so, you know, this crisis, it's in a way we've got to navigate this. And I don't think there's an easy way to do this. I think it's very much a kind of personal journey. And different people may have different ways of reconciling, of understanding, of coming to terms with. But I think it's a really deep kind of spiritual crisis that, you know, it's like all spiritual crises, it can be transformative, but it's also something to which we have to each find our individual answers and responses. But certainly I think it's there and it emerges at some point for everybody, if they go far enough along the journey.
That's very beautifully put. And that actually sort of makes me think a little bit about what we will call ecotherapy level 1 and ecotherapy level 2, and actually how, as practitioners, or no matter how far along the kind of awakening you are, the sort of introductory ecotherapy of just notice the sunset, notice the birds as they fly overhead. That's so important to just go right back to those initial small steps of connection, because that actually is the groundwork of then resourcing ourselves for then what is to come, which is often difficult, bearing witness, you know, actually, you know, to use Trebbe's phrase, attending to place that can often be so damaged or lost, and to be at that edge all the time, it is very, very difficult, and we have to just re-emerge, you know, as a connected part of the ecosystem. It actually brings to mind somebody who was I was working with, and she told me the story of a supermarket that had been built where she used to play in the meadow, and they'd, you know, cut the trees down. There was an ash tree that she used to play under, and they cut it down, and the you know, the buttercups and the daisies were gone, and there was a supermarket there, and it's just so, there's nothing that we can do, it's gone. but there is still some very powerful sort of healing that you could do if you just stand on the corner of the supermarket with that individual and just be present with them as they experience their own sort of moment in the wounded landscape. You know, that the meadow has gone forever, the tree has gone forever, but there's something that needs to be honored within that individual, that, you know, transcends the woundedness, if it and comes back. And it's so important to remember that this whole process is so supportive. And you know, I'm really interested maybe moving into asking you about what it was like working in the semi-urban environment that we found ourselves in the sort of suburbs of Leicester, and what you experienced as someone who did that for many years with different people from different parts of the country and all sorts of different ecosystems. What did you find about their responses to working in difficult places?
Well, yes, and I mean, in a way, this takes me on to the next step. I talked about how we developed the program initially in France, and this was in a rural area. We had 30 acres of land that we could work on. We could wild camp, we could do all sorts of outdoor things. And then I lost the use of that place. And I suddenly found myself back in a village just outside Leicester that was kind of semi-urban. Yes, we got some green fields around, but it was definitely, we were just right next to the M1 motorway. So it was, it wasn't a kind of pristine remote location at all. And initially I thought, well, how am I going to run ecotherapy courses here? And then I started to work with it. And actually I discovered that it was a wonderful place to live, that actually when I started to look around, there were all sorts of pockets of land I could go to with people. And actually there was far more variety in that area than there had been in France. In France, yeah, we'd had woods and we'd had fields, but it was all a fairly homogeneous kind of landscape. Whereas in Leicestershire, we had everything from the sort of municipal park to water meadows, to little areas of scruffy land where buildings had been demolished or hadn't been built or whatever, to grass verges, to noticing what was growing in the gutters, to our own garden. And we worked in all of these different places. And I think that was very rich. And, you know, I think it's left me thinking about the value of working in urban and semi-urban environments, because, you know, I think when you start to do ecotherapy, if you're working with groups and individuals, and, you know, I think a lot of this goes on in groups, it's like, if you're going to offer it to people who are going to really benefit from it, often those people live in towns, and it can be wonderful to take them out and go out into the wilds and so on for an experience. But in a way, what you're doing when you do that is you're giving that message that the experience of nature can only happen somewhere remote, somewhere far away. And while I think there's real value in that, and it can be a huge eye-opener for somebody to suddenly be taken up a mountain or taken out on the water, or, you know, whatever it is, away from their urban lifestyle, at the same time, there is something disconnected about it, and something that says you can only experience nature far away from home. Whereas actually, I think working with people just down the road from where they live, there's always something that you can work with that gives you that experience of connecting. And actually finding it on your own doorstep, in your own environment, I think can be a huge liberation in that respect. It says something about, you know, nature is not something separate from us. It's something that we're part of. It's something that's around us all the time. It's not something that exists somewhere out there, but it's something that I am interrelated with. You know, you can always look out your window and see the sky. You can always see, there's always birds of some kind, you know, whether they're city pigeons or seagulls around here. I'm living near the sea at the moment, or, you know, whatever it is, there's always something there that's alive. life has an amazing way of coming back in all sorts of circumstances. And, you know, that's a message in itself. You know, have a look around in your house and you find all sorts of things growing. Life doesn't just stop. Life carries on and it comes back, and it's rich and it's varied, and it has a way of recreating itself. So yes, I'm very interested in working in these semi-urban environments, and urban environments for that matter, and looking at what becomes possible there.
Yeah, and that was very much my personal experience coming from County Durham in the Durham Dales. You know, it's all very well, allegedly, seemingly so pristine, and then coming and thinking to myself, how can you practice ecotherapy in the suburbs? But actually, it was very, very rich and very powerful. And learning about, as you said, the reality that a lot of people are now usually live in urban environments, and so having a way for them to connect gives it authenticity, and it gives a validation to the richness of a human-made sort of site, like a town or a city. That it isn't just humans who live there; it's everything else. It's the grass, it's the dandelions, it's the you know, the nesting birds in the gutter. And I think that's a very important validation for being interconnected into being in cities, and that's very encouraging for people. I think it's something that we all need to hold on to in many, many ways. That we can't just escape. We can't go and live on, you know, desert islands and pretend that none of this is happening. We have to find connection right where we are. And your course very much did that for me. I'm just wondering if Trebbe, have you got any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, lots. I'm thinking all along. Well, first of all, I was just recollecting when you were talking about the nature in the city, of a woman that I did a program in a clear-cut forest in Canada, in British Columbia. And there were a lot of ancient old cedar trees that had been cut down. And one of the women on the program came back and she started to think anew, because she and her husband had their room in their house paneled with cedar. And she started to look at the room in her house in an entirely different way, because she realized that it had probably come from an old tree like this. You know, it wasn't just born in the lumber store. And so she did a ceremony for this cedar in her house. But I did have a question. I think, you know, the whole field of ecotherapy is so important and so essential. And so my question is, it seems like it's often focused on nature healing humans, like you go into nature and to heal humans. But there's also the complement to that, isn't there? Of how do humans think about nature that's hurt and give back to nature, which of course is Radical Joy for Hard Times' approach. I mean, do you work with your clients? Do you work in both those directions, or does it mostly kind of focus in one?
I'm not sure I could kind of put it one way or the other, but I think the ideal is that it's a reciprocal relationship. You know, I think the initial thing is something about actually engaging to the point where you recognize and you see what's really going on around you. And I think your example of going into the cut forest, I mean, that's a really hard thing to do. And, you know, I think when the person does that, and, you know, that's a particularly dramatic example, but, you know, even just walking into a local park, you know, they've just cut down a tree, or, you know, the example that you were giving, Harriet, of the supermarket. You know, when the person is in these circumstances, they may start off going out into nature, expecting that nature is somehow going to heal them. But then something is moved in them that invites them to respond. And I think for me, the important thing at that point is to hear that voice that comes up in them. What is it that's moved, and what direction does it take them in? And how does it make changes in the way that they think about their life? And I think these things, they happen slowly and they happen gradually, but, you know, the person starts to think about the impact of their life, where they're buying their stuff from, what they're using, how they're doing things, how they look after their own garden, you know, whatever it is, it can have a 1,000 different ways. But I think out of that encounter, out of that recognition of the way that things change, that begins with a kind of personal trauma. I'm upset because my tree has been cut down. It then becomes something much more others directed, where the person starts to feel for the tree rather than feeling for their own loss, and starts to want to make some kind of recompense for it in whatever form that takes, you know. But I think it is a very individual path that people take. I don't know if that kind of answers what you're asking, but
it brings to mind the before COVID and the climate anxiety in younger people. Actually, just what I'm thinking is, I remember at the time I think I was sort of halfway through, or maybe no, at that point I think just finished year 1 with the ecotherapy training, and I remember at that point watching the news and feeling that these people had had a very powerful and ungrounded wake-up call to their connection to this crisis and the earth, and that it sort of catapulted them over what I would call ecotherapy level 1, which would be the just notice, just ground, get connected. So it sort of catapulted it into, I must do something about it. And I know, I was watching and I was just thinking, it's not just young people, because actually when I went to some of the school strikes, some of the parents, some of the adults were also in that very much, we've got to do something about it sort of panic.
Yeah.
And very quickly they burnt out. And I was very conscious that actually what they really needed to do was the first level of taking themselves into nature, however it presents itself, you know, a dandelion through the concrete in their pathway, or the great swathe of a mountain vista, but it's those small steps of the first connection and encounter that was missing. And what then happens is, from my experience, and I think you know I've very much learned that through the ecotherapy and having it happen to me, is that with that gentle time that you take to really get connected, it's inevitable that behavior patterns change, and you know, and a sense of service is just naturally formulated, but it's based upon a real understanding of belonging. You know, and it's not perfect, of course, you know, still need to sometimes just go for a walk and just be me, and just need the trees for me, and that's absolutely, you can't always be in that sense of service all the time. But I was just very conscious that if we don't do the first stage and take as long as it needs to take, we can't be resourced for when we need to be asked to do the difficult stuff. And I think that this is what Radjoy, for me, I've been doing this now for 11 or 12 years. For me, it's been part of my kind of my toolkit, my first aid toolkit of sort of my sort of sense of connection to the world, where creating something and going to a wounded place, or just having the eyes to be at a place that's ugly in the landscape, or somewhere that's, you know, had some sort of catastrophe or whatever, and then making something out of what I find there, is just part of that presencing. It's part of that sort of ecotherapy level 1, and it's also moves into that kind of understanding of where I really can put my efforts. And so yeah, it's I think there is a natural flow, but it does take time.
Yes. And I think it's also something that you have to keep returning to, I mean, in a way, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the Buddhist idea of refuge. Like the most fundamental practice in Buddhism is the practice of taking refuge. And it's formalized in terms of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But what's actually meant is a kind of entrustment to something beyond ourselves. And I think that's, you know, whether you frame it in those terms, whether you think in terms of grounding, whether you think in terms of connection to the earth and the environment, whatever kind of language you use for it, I think that you have to be able to go back to a kind of place of stillness and trust that's a very embodied state. And if you can go back to that state and that sort of deep connection, yes, there's pain in it, but there's also something very nourishing in it. And that nourishment is what allows us to then carry on working. So, you know, I think a kind of groundedness is the foundation for this work. And that comes, you can frame it as level 1 ecotherapy. It's the kind of nurturance, but it's an awareness of the nurturance that's already happening. It's not so much that we decide we need to go and get something from nature, as that we start to recognize how we are already receiving something from nature. You know, our whole being depends on the earth that we sit on, the plants that feed us, the air that we breathe, the sunlight, and so on and so forth. It's already there. And most of us just take all that for granted. But when we start to appreciate that interconnectedness and that fact that we have all those things coming to us completely gratis through our lives, you know, as we come into an appreciation of that, we let go, we stop struggling against it and stop fighting, and we can allow ourselves to be held. And then we can open up to the grief and the pain, because we've got that kind of holding that we've got from the whole ecosystemic environment that we're in, that holds us and allows us to be big-hearted and to hold the grief. And then we can take that forward into action and do whatever needs to be done. But we're doing it from a grounded place rather than a place of fear and anxiety.
Yes, which brings me very beautifully onto the Attending to Place that Tariki Trust has hosted for us on behalf of Radical Joy for Hard Times once already this year. And we had 11 participants with some really quite beautiful feedback about how transformative it was. And I mean, Trebbe, you can maybe speak to this, but the process is very much about encounter, stepping into the emotions of what's coming up, and then into the mystery, into the sort of the other than connection, and how does that manifest, you know, in practice. Would you like to speak a little bit more, Trebbe, to that, and about how it was developed, and how it seems to me to key beautifully in with ecotherapy?
Yeah, well, I want to say also that Harriet has led one course with Tariki Trust on Attending to Place, and she's just signed on to do another one beginning on April 5th. And so that is going to be available. You can find out about that on the Tariki Trust website or on the radicaljoy.org website. And Attending to Place, like all of Radical Joy for Hard Times' practices, we deliberately have kept them very simple so that, you know, you don't have to go through a major training or any training at all, or get a degree or need a lot of tools. You don't need any tools. And it's a simple practice that I created for a small group called the Earth Ambassadors, of people who want to bring Radical Joy for Hard Times into their community. And it's just, it invites people to go to one particular wounded place 4 or 5 different times, however the course leader wants to do it. And to focus each time on a different kind of aspect of it. You focus on it emotionally. You spend one time really just kind of taking in the physical details of it. Another time it's really about kind of crossing over that line that says, I'm separate from nature and really listening to what the place has to say. So these different ways of responding. And as Harriet said on her last course with Tariki Trust, she had participants from all over the world, Japan and Poland and Australia and the US and Canada. And it's really gratifying because it really tells us that there is this universal love of place and sadness when something happens to it. So Harriet, maybe you want to say a little bit more about it and what your focus is, because it does tie in with the ecotherapy class, but anybody's able to participate.
Yeah, it is. It's totally open to anybody. I think what I've learned is that there is quite a level of perhaps surprise that even what we would call wounded or forgotten, broken places have so much to teach us. And I think that's been quite revelatory for people, that that would have been a place that I usually didn't go to, but because I didn't go to it, that when you asked me to identify where I would do the practice, I instantly knew where I was going to be. It's like that kind of where your wound becomes your strength, and I love that about the practice, and it very much fits in with the 10 directions. I remember there was one practice that you made us do. We walked down the road and we got to a junction, and there was a tiny little triangle of grass on the junction of the road, and you just I think you gave us something to do, and I actually think about that when I was teaching the attending to place. That is essentially what I would call a sort of a wounded landscape, where there's just this tiny little pocket of what seems to be acceptable within something else where we're deliberately quite blind to it. We don't want to get close to it. So there's very much a sense of being taught directly from these kind of challenged places. And what I found really beautiful is that even through their kind of degradation and mutilation and pollution, they still have such a vibrancy and vitality of life, and that's very powerful. It's very ecotherapeutic.
And perhaps because of it as well.
Caroline, I have one question that I'd like to ask you. It sort of goes back to something Harriet asked a few minutes ago, and that was that in your work you talk about other-centered therapy, and you've written about how the Western approach to therapy tends to be about self-esteem and like feeling better about oneself. But in contrast, the Buddhist therapy would be more other focused, or ecotherapy, I guess, both of them. Could you talk about, because the reason I'm really thinking about this right now as we speak with you is it just seems that as we confront more and more climate change, we have to be more other-centered, not only in terms of how we relate with other people, but also with the earth. So could you talk a bit about those differences and how that does apply to these times we're in now?
Well, yes, I mean, Buddhist psychology is all about the way that we shape our experience of the world and our view of the world based on a process of escaping from all the things that we're afraid of. That basically humans are in a state of anxiety about change, about impermanence, is often talked about in Buddhism, that the fact that we are mortal, the fact that we are born, get sick, that we die, that we lose people, these are all the things that drive our psychology. And our psychology is one of retreat. And so through the process of a retreat, we shape our perception in particular ways, which make us withdraw from the world, make us see the world through a viewpoint that basically reinforces ourselves. So, we see this in practical ways, in that we choose to associate with things that are like us and to not associate with things that are different from us. And you can see this in actually in people who are close to nature as well as people who are not. You know, people who identify as close to nature, they want to live in the wilds. They don't want to come into the town. And when you were talking earlier, Harriet, about us doing our courses in a more urban environment, there were certainly people who came on the courses who lived out in the wilds and were kind of a bit indignant that they were having to come into a much more traffic noisy, urban kind of place than they were used to living in. Because, you know, their whole identity was built up on, I'm somebody who lives in the country and I enjoy the trees and the seasons and everything else. And I don't actually want to be exposed to the person who's going up the road making a lot of noise in their fast car or whatever it is. So it's like we surround ourselves with things that are familiar and we cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. And so a Buddhist approach to therapy is something about reconnection. You know, so a Buddhist approach is all about our relationship to all those things that we cut ourselves off from, because although in a way that process of restricting our view, of surrounding ourselves with the familiar, it's comforting and it creates a kind of comfortable bubble around us, it's also very limiting, and it's the way that we actually make our lives narrower and more self-centered, you know. And I think when you look at kind of Western culture, a lot of Western culture is actually founded on the kind of values that are in that process of withdrawal. So it's founded on identity, on the whole kind of celebrity thing, the whole business of who am I, what's my career, how do I look, what have I achieved, you know, however we want to frame it. But it's all about promoting oneself and being more invested in oneself. And this is the way that society goes. And that's all perpetuated through a process of consumption on the one hand. So we can see on the global level, the whole emphasis on growth, economic health, in terms of the more we produce, the more we create, the more we sell, and so on and so forth. And this kind of myth of endless growth and so on, this is the foundation of our society. And likewise, the other side of the coin is cutting off from things that don't fit with our picture. And so the whole thing is predicated on these processes that Buddhism describes as greed, hate, and delusion. So we want more and more, even when we don't actually need more and more. And we also set ourselves apart from those things that threaten us in some way, that are not part of ourselves. So other-centered work is something about reversing those processes. It's about stepping out of that bubble that we've created and about reconnecting with others. And the others are often uncomfortable for us. You know, it's like those wounded places that you're talking about. Those are others that they're uncomfortable because they disturb that image of the perfect life, the comfortable life, the life that is pretty, that is healthy, that is growing, and so on. And when you find something that is wounded, that is dying, that is ugly, that has been destroyed, then that threatens all those things that we've been psychologically working to build up. But actually, if we can connect with those things, if we can actually come to recognize those things, then something much healthier happens. And this is the basis of Buddhist psychology, that it's about stepping out of that very self-orientated position in which we're just caught up in accumulation and in distancing, to something that's much more open, that's much more accepting of what is, that's more honest. It's about an honest relationship with the world. It's not seeing ourselves as isolated items, but as something that is part of an interconnected system. So I think Buddhism is a very ecological spirituality in that respect. You know.
Thank you. It's really fascinating.
I feel like you've just in those last few moments explained Radical Joy for Hard Times, actually. Just how to turn towards the things that actually might counter your assumptions about your easy life. You know, if you are actually physically brought to bear witness to something that holds a shadow of your culture or of your development or of your career path, you know, how do you feel about that? What do you do with that? How do you bear witness and make beauty and find the beauty in that kind of challenging space? Because it is, as you say, the deepest and most necessary kind of communication and connection to our inner world and outer world, and all of the things that we need to do, I think, in our living on this planet. And just finally, just want to explain, I don't know whether you know this, but Trebbe's friend long time ago had to, he was an engineer of some sort. Now, I forgive me if I'm totally wrong about this, but he had been commissioned to get rid of a slag heap that was sort of like leftovers from some sort of industrial process. And he started stomping up this huge slag heap saying, "I'm going to conquer you." And then he stopped in his tracks and just realized that this was an orphan from the circle of life. This mound represented something that was no longer part of the detritivore, you know, return to mulch to then become relived. It was orphaned, i.e. separated. And that radical shift from something to conquer to something to feel compassion for and understanding, and in the widest scheme of things to recognize that it was in itself a victim of these huge systems, these cultural systems. And, you know, so much of what you've just said makes me think that, you know, these wounded places, these orphaned places are becoming more and more numerous, and they're in our landscapes, they're in our suburbs, they're in our, you know, down the road. I think most of us now have some story that says, yes, I can absolutely think of at least one example of a place that I'd rather not know about. I'd rather just ignore it, or it's toxic, it's not right. And it's about learning to bring them back into the family, you know, bringing them back into all, and it's very much Jungian shadow work as well, I'm sure, where we have to recognize those shadows writ large in the landscape. And that's very much what I feel like you've just spoken to. So thank you.
Yes, and I think there's a kind of mirroring between inner and outer in these things, you know, which I think is very interesting, because, and I don't want to sort of put the emphasis on either, but I think both aspects are important, because we all have those inner aspects of our landscape which are shadow, which are ugly, which are damaged and wounded, and these things are in our environment. And actually accepting one, we accept the other, and embracing and healing one, we embrace and heal the other. And that reflection between the psychological and the environmental, I think is very fundamental to ecotherapy. And the important aspect of it is that it's not a bias towards one. It's not just about healing our psychology. It's not just about healing the environment. It's about the way that there's a reciprocal relationship between them.
Yeah, that's just perfectly said and succinctly rounded up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you anything else to comment or ask, Caroline, Trebbe?
No, I don't. And we don't have any questions on Facebook. There are a few people who've said hello and thank you, but I'm sure we'll have more later. But it's been really fascinating to talk to you, Caroline. Thank you so much. And I want to just say, Caroline has written how many books? 7 have you written? You've written many
7,
books.
yes, that's right.
Yeah, please look up Caroline's books, and a combination of Buddhism and ecotherapy and her own stories.
So thank you so much, Caroline, for coming to our cafe, and I hope you had a nice cup of tea to sup on. So I'll hand over. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been very rich. It's been a lovely discussion.
Yeah, it really has. Thank you so much. You're 2 wonderful people. You are just a joy to have in my life. So I just wanted to say that as well. So thank you. And Trebbe, would you like to close the
I
cafe?
will close. And I want to say that on our next Earth Exchange Cafe, which will be Wednesday, February 16th, and we have Argy, oh dear, I'm not going to pronounce her last name right. Please forgive me, and Carolina, and they're from Artivism, which is a group at Adelphi University in New York. And they are all about using art as a way of expressing feelings and also opinions and protests about ecology and society and discrimination. So they're going to be here, and they're going to have photos of their work and their students' work. So that'll be really interesting. February 16th. And as we now conclude our Earth Exchange Cafe for the month of January, we thank everyone for coming. Your tea or your coffee or your chocolate is all finished, and there's just a little bit left in the cup, and it's getting cold. And everyone, the chatter in the cafe is dimming, and the lights are about to go down, and it's time to bundle up and leave the cafe and saying goodbye to Caroline and Harriet and me, and we will see you next month.